I thought this was going to be a relatively easy job. I mean, 3 live edge shelves. How much work could it be? Remember these walnut desks I did recently? Well, there was this little nook in the corner that was just begging for some matching floating shelves. But it was going to require some creative fitting, a bit of engineering with some sparkly steel accoutrement, a whomper of a jig, a wee bit of downright hackery, and with some feline assistance, everything went to plan. Well, almost everything. So for this project, I'm playing the away game again down at True Trade Carpentry, kind of mixing my time, a little down there, a little back at my own shop. First order of business was to get these live edge slabs cut to rough dimension. Unfortunately, I had to cut this big old crotch off. Sounds painful, but I promise you I did it with care. Now my track saw didn't go the full depth through this 2.5-inch thick slab, so I had to flip it over, carry the line around roughly, and finish the cut until I got all the way through. And don't worry, this offcut will go to a good home, and that does not mean having hairpin legs screwed to the bottom and made into a side table. All of my offcut recipients are fully vetted on their intentions. Now I also needed to cut off this little kind of goiter on the edge there so I could have a flat surface to run over the jointer. And then I had to grab another slab. Now I only had 2 slabs, but I needed 3 shelves. Now each one of these slabs has 2 live edges, so I'm going to have to cheat a little bit and steal one of the live edges and glue it on to a non-live edge piece. Well, I mean that sounds like cheating, but the non-live edge piece at one point had its own live edge. I'm just going to transplant a new one onto it. You know, a new and improved one. So I took the live edge offcut, flattened one side, put a nice square edge on it, and then took the remaining slab and gave me a nice square edge on that as well. Now I wasn't sure of the exact width of these shelves at this point, so I couldn't run them over the jointer. So I just skip planed them both sides through the planer just to give me a look at the grain, see how everything looked, and just get all that pesky roughness off. You guys ever notice when you try to text or type the word planer, autocorrect always changes it to the word planet? So annoying. Now back at my shop is where the live edge transplant surgery was going down. And it just so happened that I had some air-dried walnut from the same tree around my shop, so I was able to cut some strips and then glue that live edge on. And voila, we now have a new live edge slab that, well, it was a live edge slab, but now it's a new and improved live edge slab. Then back down to True Trade Carpentry, I was able to rip these to the width, which is about 14 inches, and that allowed me to easily get one face flat on their 16-inch joiner and then run everything through the planer to get a nice, consistent thickness. Meanwhile, back at my shop, Jerry's playing with my pencil. Sorry, I need that. Now, to make sure that these shelves didn't interfere with the window in the corner of the room, they needed to be somewhere between 45 and 50 inches or so. But at this point, I'm just cutting them to rough length, so I think I did these at about 52 inches. I still need to shape one end, and the other end needs a groove, and I have to stabilize some cracks, so I wanted to make sure I left myself some extra on both ends. So I marked out where I could eliminate some of those waste and cracks and then squared off those lines, and with the track saw, I could remove them. Sorry there, fella, but you're destined for the fire pit. And then with both ends squared off, I realized I still had a lot of epoxy stabilizing left to do. Both sides, and the end. Oy, oy, oy. And that wasn't the only slab that was in need of some filling. This one had a nice big knot on the end too. Now you've probably seen me do this before, but I'm just coating all these areas that I'm going to pour the epoxy with some shellac to seal it. And that'll make sure none of this turtle boat, baby. High performance epoxy mixed with this black pigment dispersion goes into the cracks and leaves this black filthy haze around it. Now, I've never tried it, but someone else did suggest that you could also use shellac in a rattle can and spray these areas rather than sealing it up with liquid shellac. So, either way, brush or can, it will get the job done, and it will save you loads of headache and sanding later. Isn't that right, little man? Now, to shape the open end of these shelves, I thought it'd be a good idea to kind of match the contour of the desktop. So I did take a tracing of it when I was there and made this little cardboard template. Now, I will admit it's a bit rudimentary, but it doesn't have to be perfect, just something to give me the general shape so I can cut it and then shape it with the sander and a router and various other things. Well, there's really no other things, those two things. Now, when I was roughing these out with the jigsaw, I got to do one of my favorite things, and that is break a jigsaw blade so it's lodged in the piece and you can't get it out. So I came at it from the other side until I met in the middle and broke off the chunk and dislodged the broken chunk of toothy metal. And I did this to all 3 shelves, while these 2 were no help at all. Especially you. Ah! Okay, sleep tight, everyone. Now that this epoxy is dry, I can try to clean up all the spillover. I like to use a card scraper first just to clean away the bulk of the waste before hitting it with my palm sander, and the sound isn't annoying at all. Okay, so around those corners, I needed to kind of fake in that live edge angle, so I'm using a 22.5 degree router bit in my router. And, you know, I don't really use this little dust collection port much, but I gotta say, it works pretty good. And now that the bulk of that material is removed, I can grab my sander with some 80 grit and just kind of try to blend it in and make it look natural. And I'm also using a soft pad on my sander here, so it will glide over those contours a little bit easier. So with one done, I just proceeded to do the same thing on the other 2 shelves. Boy, that little dust collection port really does a good job. And then a little more sanding just to blend everything and make it look like it was always there. And then it was back down to True Trade shop to give me a nice, flat, square edge on the back of these shelves because, well, we've got some work to do to drill out some holes for the mounting brackets that will be custom fabricated for this job. And there we have the floating shelf trifecta, all shaped, sanded, and jointed. Then it was next door to see Ryan at Liquid Metalworks, where he is laser cutting these special brackets that I designed. As you can see, there are a bunch of mounting slots, as well as a couple of holes for the posts that will be welded on. Now, I have no idea where the studs are in the wall, so I needed to give myself plenty of options when doing the install. And I'm not a metal guy, but I did learn a few things here, because these mounting plates were so narrow, and the laser put so much heat into them, they did deform quite a bit. So Ryan had to spend a lot of time shaping and bending and tweaking to get them flat and straight. Now, once they were within tolerance, then the 8-inch post could be welded on. Well, I guess they're tacked on first and then welded with metal. Then we could grind all that down nice and smooth. And check this out. Flat, square, equidistant, symmetrical. Very nice. And then began the arduous task of cutting all the recesses in the back of the shelves so that the brackets would fit nice and flush. Now, Ryan was kind enough to cut me this extra one so I could use that instead of having the posts on it to size everything. Once I marked out my holes, I could then find the center and then the width of my slots that I wanted to be. These needed to be elongated so that I could slide the shelf onto the post and slide it over to the wall on the left-hand side. Now, to start these holes perfectly, I'm using the Panto router with this 3/4 inch, 2.5 inch long bit. So I could only go 2.5 inches in here. But what it's going to do is basically provide me with the perfect guide that is straight, square, and in the exact same position on all pieces. I can't wait to use this machine a lot more with my joinery when that requires much bigger mortise and tenons than a regular domino can give you. So after the machine was set up, I got all 9 of these slots cut in about 10 minutes. Pretty crazy. I only wish they could go to that 8-inch depth that I needed. And to get to that 8-inch depth, I bought this Forstner bit extender that you can screw in your Forstner bit and give you all kinds of extended depth. Now, fortunately, that sleeve where you're attaching the bit is exactly 3/4 of an inch, which is exactly the hole that I needed to drill. Unfortunately, those little set screws stood proud and would have interfered with drilling the hole, so I had to grind them down. And then I made this whomper of a jig. Now, since these live edge slabs obviously have an irregular edge, I needed some way to hold them perfectly vertical and square to the drill press. So the shelves just slide in vertically, and then I clamp them in place and they can't move. Now, unfortunately, my drill press is a benchtop model, so I couldn't really slide this under there. So I just stayed at Liquid Metalworks. He was kind enough to let me borrow his drill press. Now, the only bad thing about this is you only have 5 inches of throw or quill travel, so I could only go so deep. But I can tell you this took forever. Because as soon as you start drilling down deep, that Forstner bit gets clogged, you have to pull it back out, or it starts to burn. So it was a lengthy process to only get to 5 inches. And I had to extend it out and hang it over the drill press table, so I just used some scrap pieces of aluminum, moved my jig over, and just continued on down. Now, some of you might be saying, well, why didn't you just leave the drill bit in all the way as far as it would go and then raise the table to go deeper? Well, I can tell you, that would have probably taken longer, and to do that in 3 different offset holes in 3 different slots on 3 different shelves would have taken a month of Sundays. So I'm going as deep as I can here. Now I'm using overlapping or offset holes here, 3 sets to go across. Since these are 2 1/4 inch slots, I am just using that 3/4 inch bit and stepping it over a little bit each time. And then this is what you're left with inside the hole. So still not to full depth, and we'll need those ridged walls all cleaned up. And then it was time to start the hand drilling. And this proved to be just as frustrating as using the drill press. You could only go so deep before that Forstner bit got clogged and wouldn't cut. Then using a screwdriver, trying to get all that waste and shavings loosened up so I could vacuum it out. Now the other option instead of a Forstner bit would be to use something much more aggressive like an auger bit. But my experience with those is it really wants to pull you into the work and go wherever it wants to go. This was a little bit more of a delicate operation. Okay, I know this doesn't look like a delicate operation, but I had to be a little Neanderthal with this to try to clean all those walls up using this 9-inch long paring chisel. And the blade was a little thin, so it was a little flexible, so, finesse wasn't really helping me here. And I can tell you this again, this took forever. Cleaning those walls, making sure they're perfectly square, vacuuming it out. Look, I got a miner's light on to get to see to the bottom. It was, wow, way longer than I thought it was going to take. Even Jerry fell asleep. Of course, that doesn't take much. And finally, with all the drilling and mining and cleaning up and sanding, I could finally get to applying the finish. Now, I'm using Osmo Pollux satin on these. Why Osmo over Rubio? Well, Osmo is much clearer on sapwood and will not orange or yellow it as much as Rubio Pure will. So that's why I tend to use the Osmo Pollux anytime I have sapwood going on. So with one side done, flip it over to the other side, as well as that edge, of course. And after letting that soak in for 10 or 15 minutes, I wiped off all the excess using a microfiber cloth. And the next day after that coat had dried, I could now work on cutting the recess in the back of all these shelves that would accept that mounting plate so it would be nice and flush. So here's my bracket with the posts installed. So I'm just going to drop this in there, kind of trace a line all the way around just to give me an idea of the location. I made sure the posts were centered in the holes left to right, and then it was time to make a pretty big mess. Now I'm starting with a 1/4 inch spiral upcut bit. This is going to establish the upper and lower wall of my recess or groove. And because this recess is centered, I'm able to just flip the router around and run it the other way, and those grooves will be the same distance from both edges, top and bottom. Then to clear all the waste out, I swapped in a 1/2 inch bit and followed the same process. 1 pass all the way down, flip the router around, and 1 pass all the way back. And that clear base plate is the Tamar 3x3 custom router jig. It works awesome for this. You just screw down those fences and everything is set. And then one last thing to do on that back groove was just to square up the ends with a chisel. Now I also needed to cut a groove in the end of each shelf. This would slide in a cleat that was going to be screwed to the side wall. Now rather than do this with the router, I thought it would be faster on the table saw with a dado stack. So I just set up a 5/8 stack, made 1 pass on all 3 shelves, moved the fence over a little bit, and made a 2nd pass. Now this wasn't to the full depth that I needed. I didn't want to do all that in 1 pass. It's a lot of material to remove. So once that first depth pass was made in all the shelves, I just raised the blade up to 1 inch using this little 1, 2, 3 block, and then repeated the same process. Now, one thing to be very mindful of here is you don't want to pass this all the way through, otherwise you're going to end up with a groove right in the front edge of your shelf. As you can see, I didn't go all the way, and the way I determined this was I put pencil lines on my zero clearance insert indicating where the blade started and stopped. That way I made sure that I didn't go too far. I put a corresponding line on my shelf itself. Hopefully you can see that little white pencil line. And once those were lined up, then I could back it off and know I didn't go too far. And there you go, full groove. And with all my grooves cut, now I can apply finish in there to seal everything and then put a second coat on everything else. It was another late night in the shop, and although Jerry was hanging out, he wasn't too keen on actually helping. Which is fine, because that Osmo tends to get a little tacky in his fur since I don't have any nitrile gloves that fit his paws. What do you say, buddy? You ready to go to bed? Yeah, me too. And now with everything complete, it was install day. All right, here's the layout. The tape signifies where each floating shelf is going to go. There'll be a TV mounted by somebody else up there. The first order of business is to start cutting away this soundproofing, find our studs, and mount our flanges. So this is the same thickness as the shelf.
Okay, gotcha.
So we're gonna put that right there. And that there's my buddy Pete from Petrie's Workshop, who gave up his entire Saturday, drive up to Connecticut with me and install these shelves. Yeah, I said all day. This took 8 hours. So let's get into it. Now, the original plan here was to just cut strips out of the soundproofing foam and slide our shelves in there, minimize damage. Well, after we put this piece up and started cutting the foam, I realized it would be easier and actually probably neater if we just took off a giant square of it. That would allow us to see the wall, find our studs much easier, and then we could piece back in the foam because there was plenty left over from the original install. So with our outer lines established and the foam peeled off the back wall and then the side wall, we could get to work on finding our studs. And then with our first shelf kind of held lightly in place, you can see the green tape on the shelf. That signifies the slots that we had cut for the posts. So I'm just transferring those marks to the wall. That way I know exactly where they're going to be because we're going to have to stabilize those holes. Yep, stabilize. Then we could place our mounting bracket on the wall and slide it over into position and place those mounting rods right in the middle of where we laid out our slots from before. Now, the back lip of the recess on the back of the shelf was about 3/16 of an inch. Now, I didn't bring any spacer blocks with me, so grabbed a couple popsicle sticks, and Pete wrapped them in green tape and gave us the exact dimension. And then we could transfer the lines from our mounting slots exactly where they needed to be to install some aluminum stabilizers. Now, you can screw anything into the wall, and even if you grab the stud, there will still be a little bit of play if you put a lot of weight on it because it's going to compress the drywall. So to help avoid this, I bought some 3/4 inch by 1 inch long aluminum spacers. Now, these are actually going into the stud about 1/4 of an inch. And then we could secure everything with these headlock bolts by Fasten Master. These are set to replace 3/8 lag bolts. They are ultra strong. And on the sidewall, we screwed in some plywood cleats that would fit right in the groove that we'd put in the side of the shelves. Unfortunately, the fragile crotch in that corner snapped off when we were trying to mount this shelf. So we'll have to fix that later. I just used a little CA glue. But in the meantime, we can get this pushed on nice and tight. There was really no need to scribe this to the wall because the purple soundproofing seemed to hide most inconsistencies. So with that first shelf on, albeit giving us a little trouble in the corner there, we could move on to the second, following the same procedure, holding up the mounting bracket, tracing our slots, and then drilling for and inserting our aluminum spacers. And then it was bolt time, and then dry fitting time. Now this one started off pretty easy, but it fought us the whole way. And I mean really fought us. And we just couldn't figure out why until we got to the top shelf and figured out what the problem was. But let me see if I can explain what happened here. When I had cut the groove in the end of the shelf, I left 5/16 worth of material there and only 3/16 here, which matched the back side. But when you flip it over and look at the back side, yes, those two lines line up, but these do not. And we had put that cleat on the side wall at the same height as the bracket. So that is why it fought us the whole way. The cleat was actually up here. So the only way this thing would fit is to really force it. And like I mentioned, we were level left to right, but when I put a level on it afterwards, it was actually Oh, hello, Jerry. It was actually tilted backward towards the wall, which is fine. If it had been leaning forward, we would have been in trouble. Now, the reason we got the first shelf right is because we used spacers on the foam to match the distance. So as I mentioned, it was perfectly level, at least left to right. So with that little detail figured out with the cleat that it needed to be lowered a little, this last shelf, well, as you can see, it slid right on. And as lame as it may be to show on camera, this one deserved a fist bump. Now, I wasn't super worried about these shelves sliding off forward. The foam itself was going to keep it in place, but just in case, I drilled a couple axis holes, and then these little grub screws or set screws I ran all the way up in until they touched the metal rod. That will ensure those shelves cannot move front to back. And the last thing left to do besides clean up was to piece in all this foam, the hardest piece being this one here where I had to scribe it to 3 separate shelves. They were all kind of at different depths and different profiles. So that took a little bit to get that exactly right. But once that was in, it was just a matter of filling in a bunch of squares or rectangles. Now, we were using a utility knife, but realized, hey, I brought the track saw. We can just cut this foam nice and straight perfectly every time. So that's what we did. Cut all these pieces and then peeled off the adhesive backing and then covered up all our markings and other sins underneath. And I gotta tell you, this was one of the most satisfying parts of the install, covering up all that white drywall and then seeing how the walnut contrasted so nicely with the purple. And I'm sure a lot of you aren't fans of the purple, but the purple is there because the logo of the investment firm that these are going in is purple. So you gotta coordinate. And now a final view of all the shelves in place, the foam back in place, and these things are ready to have, well, an investment firm, so maybe they're just going to put stacks of money on there. I don't know. But everything looked nice, fit nice, like they had always been there. Now, obviously, it would have been easier to install these before the foam had went in, but we didn't have that luxury. We made it look as seamless as possible, and I'm very happy with the way they came out. Huge thanks to my buddy Pete, again, for all the help during install day. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you on the next one.